Have you ever wondered how some things work? Like the things that are really complicated and confusing to figure out? Take FaceTime, for example. How in the world does it take my voice and my face and show it to someone else? How does the video and sound travel to some other location or even across the world? Oh, and it does all of this at the exact moment I'm using it. I'm not sure how FaceTime works, but I still use it all the time. I mean, I'm starting to think it's some invention by some fictional technological superpower like Wakanda or some Marvel multiverse I can't comprehend. What about virtual reality? How can you put on a pair of goggles and feel like you're in a different world? The sights, the sounds, and even the way your stomach turns, it all makes it seem like you're somewhere else when you're literally standing in your bedroom. How can that even happen? I don't know about you, but I've often wondered how things work. Hey, I'm Jean. And when I just can't make sense of something like FaceTime or a VR headset, I get really curious. And when that curiosity can't be satisfied, then I get frustrated. So I am not great at home improvement things, but one time I tried to put up these floating shelves that I saw on Pinterest that someone did in their living room, and I researched all the things, I bought the supplies, I cut the lumber, I bought all the power tools that I needed, looked up YouTube videos to figure out how to put up some floating shelves. And so then I had everything set up, I was ready to go, and when I got my power tool, got the drill bit and the screw to put in the wall, I hit metal. And then I was like, ah! I quit! I can't figure this out anymore. I don't know what to do. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that sometimes I feel this way about God. And maybe you do too. Maybe you've wondered how all of this faith stuff really works. Maybe you've wondered if God is even out there at all. And if God is out there, maybe you've been frustrated because you can't seem to understand what God is doing or why God is doing it. I mean, trust me, you're not alone. I think we all feel this way from time to time for a lot of reasons. For starters, we can't actually see God. That makes believing or understanding how God works a lot harder. And even if we do believe in God, we don't always feel God's presence in our lives. And that can make us question a lot of things. Sometimes when we go through difficult circumstances, it doesn't feel like God is there for us. Or sometimes when we see the way other Christians act, it makes us think there's no way God could be who we think God is if that's the way Christians behave. Maybe you've thought one or even all of these things at some point in your life. I know I have many times. Some of us walked in here today wondering if this God stuff is even worth our attention. We have a hard time trusting or believing because we can't see or understand how God works. And deep down, we question if any of this faith stuff can actually be real. Others of us walked in here believing in God. We go to church, we show up at small group, we pray, and we do all the other things we think Christians are supposed to do. But if we're being honest, we've been thinking about questions like the ones we've been talking about today for a while. We might act like we're good with our faith, but deep down, we carry all sorts of doubts and questions. And honestly, all that's okay. Doubts and questions can actually be great for your faith. They have the potential to motivate you to really start looking for answers and learning more about God. Being curious about God and how faith works is a really good thing. It's a thing that can help us lean into really understanding who God is and how God works. And that can ultimately grow our faith. So if you're watching this with questions or doubts about God, I'm so glad you're watching today, because what we're going to discover is going to help us really get to know more about the God who is always there, always working, and always wants us to know more. Of course, we're not the first people in the world to ask questions or wonder how God really works. People have been doing that for thousands of years. In fact, a guy named Philip asked Jesus a question about God nearly 2,000 years ago. What's interesting is that Philip was one of the closest friends Jesus had on earth. Philip walked with Jesus, talked with him, and paid attention to everything he did. Philip started to understand that there was something special about Jesus after spending some time with him. To Philip, it seemed like Jesus had this really unique understanding of who God is and how God works. Because of that, I think Philip decided to take his questions about God directly to Jesus himself. So one day, Philip asked if he could see God and experience God the way Jesus did. He probably wasn't expecting Jesus' response. Take a look. Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you such a long time." I don't know about you, but if I were Philip, I'd be a little confused by Jesus' response. Of course, Philip knew Jesus. He spent a ton of time talking with and learning from Jesus. What did knowing Jesus have to do with knowing what God is like? How was his friendship with Jesus supposed to help Philip understand anything about God? Well, let's look at the next part of what Jesus said to his friend. "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." Jesus responded in this way because he wanted Philip to understand that knowing Jesus is the same as knowing God. Basically, Jesus was saying, "Philip, if you want to know what God is like, just look at me." Jesus used this one thing to change everything about the way we all understand who God is. In that moment, Jesus was not only claiming to be God, he was telling Philip that everything he did and said was exactly what God would do and say. In other words, Jesus shows us who God is and how God works because he is God. Think about what this moment would have been like for Philip. He'd been following Jesus and had experienced some incredible moments along the way. He saw Jesus heal a blind man. He saw Jesus show forgiveness and patience to a woman in the middle of a pretty bad situation. He saw Jesus raise a dead guy named Lazarus back to life. He even saw Jesus kneel down to wash his feet the way a servant would have done back in that time. Philip had the opportunity to get to know Jesus. He watched the way Jesus cared for, loved, and healed all sorts of different people. As he got to know Jesus over time, Philip learned to love and trust Jesus. Before their conversation, Philip might have had a hard time understanding God because he couldn't see and feel God. But after Jesus' response to Philip, he understood that there was a way to know so much about who God is and how God works. And that's by getting to know Jesus. Jesus is God. How he lived is how God would live. What Jesus said is what God would say. And if Philip wanted to know what God was really like, all he had to do was look to Jesus. And the same is true for us. Jesus is how you get to know God. Why is knowing God so important? One of Jesus' closest friends, Matthew, recorded a conversation that Jesus had with some really important people that gives us an idea. Let's take a look. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Jesus is saying that life is about loving God, loving people, and loving ourselves. That's what's most important. That's what's in first place. One way that we can love God is by getting to know God, by getting to know more about God's heart, actions, character, and work. That's how we can love God. And Jesus shows us everything we need to know about who God really is. Jesus is the answer to all of our questions about God. We get a chance to understand the way God works and what God cares about most when we get to know Jesus. We don't have to wonder how God works or if we'll ever figure God out. Instead, we can look at Jesus to see who God is and what God is like, because Jesus is how you get to know God. We can start getting to know God right now by doing these things. First, learn. Learn more about Jesus. Learn about what he did, what he said, and how he lived by reading real accounts in the Bible called the Gospels. The Gospels were documented by real people who actually watched how Jesus lived and listened to Jesus' words. As you read the Gospels, pay attention to what you learn, what questions you have, and what they show you about who God is. Then, Listen, think of someone you know who loves Jesus. Maybe it's a small group leader or an adult you live with or friend. Ask them to tell you more of their story and what they've learned about Jesus. As you listen to them share, remember that we can learn about Jesus from how other people have experienced him in their lives too. Now, maybe you don't fully believe all this God stuff yet, or maybe you're not sure if Jesus was telling the truth to Philip. If that's you, I totally understand. I've had similar doubts and questions along the way too. That's why I want to encourage you to learn and listen this week. Make that a first place priority before you make a decision about faith. My hope is that for all of us, as we get to know Jesus more through learning about him and listening to other stories, we'll get to know God in a way that truly changes our lives and our faith. Because Jesus is how you get to know God.